certainly know how criminals select their victims. Why her? Why that house? Why that night? The MacGyvers were a wonderful family couple. They didn't have any enemies. There just weren't people that would say bad things about them. In any homicide investigation, you look at all of the information, everything that surrounds the neighborhood, the time of day, the lifestyles of the victim. You look at everything to try and make a determination of which way to go to focus the investigation.
Tavernier Key, a small, peaceful town in the Florida Keys, where murders are almost as rare as frost. But the usual tranquility is shattered on an August morning when a young couple named Missy and Michael MacGyver are discovered murdered in their home. A young couple is found dead in their home. The first investigators to reach the scene find Michael MacGyver lying on the living room floor. His eyes and mouth are covered with tape. There are bruises on his neck. Towards the back of the house, investigators find MacGyver's wife, Missy.
Missy's body was found in their bedroom, in their master bedroom, near the foot of the bed. She was nude, and her hands were bound and then tied to her feet in a sort of a hog tie position. The ligature around her neck was partially a tie, a man's tie, and a tie from a robe.
There are signs that Missy had been sexually assaulted before she was killed, so the bed sheets are sent to the crime lab for DNA testing. Investigators uncover several additional clues. A metal pipe, presumably used during the crime. A ladder propped up against a balcony. And most ominously, severed phone lines, suggesting to investigators that the crime may have been planned. Someone wanted Missy and Michael MacGyver dead, but who and why?
They made a very nice couple, very nice young couple. And they got along great. She had a nursery where she was going to be working at the school, and they had a baby on the way.
Missy MacGyver was an elementary school teacher. She loved children and was excited about the prospect of soon having one of her own.
Missy MacGyver was a wonderful young woman. She'd grown up typical middle class, upper middle class family. She was very much looking forward to her teaching career. Everybody loved Missy. She was great.
Her husband, however, was a different story.
Mike MacGyver was a young man who was a mechanic, airplane mechanic. He was a pilot. He had just purchased a plane in Central America that had been seized in a drug smuggling incident.
There were rumors that Michael MacGyver was dealing drugs and running with a dangerous crowd. One witness interviewed by detectives had this to say: "I told him he was dealing with people who wouldn't put up with his bull. The kid thought he was bulletproof."
Mike had a lot of irons in the fire, rumors being that perhaps he had irritated some of his partners to the point that perhaps this was the outcome.
But was the murder drug-related or a sex crime? Was he the target or was she? The investigators aren't sure yet, so they request a criminal profiler to help narrow the scope of the investigation. Special Agent Dale Hinman gets the call.
Profilers come to the investigation for a variety of different reasons. The day that we were invited to the Florida Keys to have a look at this case, it was to either help to focus the case in the direction of whether it was one or two offenders, whether it was a lone offender for sexual reasons, was it a group of offenders who came because of drugs.
Special Agent Hinman's 20-year career as a criminal profiler has taught her to read between the lines of a crime scene. And from the moment she sees the police photographs from the MacGyver house, Agent Hinman suspects that Missy was the killer's target, not Michael. But will the crime scene support her theory?
I felt that this had nothing to do with drugs, that Missy was the targeted victim. It was not a burglary that went awry or someone that was there for another reason that decided to change course and go in this direction. It was someone who was focused on her before they even got to the house.
If Agent Hinman is right, someone wanted to kill Missy MacGyver. But police don't just have a single suspect. Instead, they have several. A young married couple is murdered at their home in the Florida Keys. Some investigators think the husband may have been the victim of a drug deal gone wrong. But Special Agent Dale Hinman doesn't buy it.
My first impressions of this crime when I saw the photos was that it was not a drug execution. When you look at the position of the male and the female victims, the husband was in the living room and his eyes were covered and his mouth was covered. So if this was a situation where people were trying to get him to say something or torture his wife and get him to see it and then respond to it and give them money or give them drugs, then the way his position was, there's no way that he could see or respond to any questions or any torture.
A background check on Mike MacGyver reveals that 4 years before his murder, he had been arrested by U.S. Customs agents on a remote airstrip in Central Florida after landing an airplane with drug residue aboard. But MacGyver was never convicted. A look at his finances also reveals that Michael was heavily in debt. But Special Agent Hinman is still convinced that Missy, not Michael, was the intended target. She compares notes with lead investigator Jerry Powell.
When you look at what happened to Mrs. MacGyver, the amount of bindings that was used to control her, the blindfold, the putting on of bindings and removing of bindings made us go in the direction that she was the targeted victim and that so much more happened to her during this crime than happened to her husband, that he was merely there and in the way and eliminated so that the perpetrator could focus on the intended victim, Mrs. MacGyver.
So there had been a considerable amount of attention paid to her. The motive, however, as to who the target was and what the motive was, sometimes seemed to be at odds with each other.
For Hinman, the case is clear-cut. Even if she doesn't understand the motive, the crime scene tells her the killer was after Missy MacGyver when he entered the house. And even though some investigators think the crime is drug-related, they still must check out other potential suspects, including some who had visited the MacGyver house in the days leading up to the murders.
So I would imagine that the canvass would have taken quite a long time to locate all the people who lived near this airstrip or, within view of the home or who frequent and come through this area.
In one sense, started working backwards from the time the bodies were found to who had been in or near the residence. There had been a UPS delivery man there earlier in the day. There were also some people who had assisted Mike in refurnishing, remodeling one of the bedrooms in expectation of the new baby.
While investigators canvass the neighborhood to find potential suspects, they do a background check on anyone who lives or works close to the MacGyver house. An attendant at a gas station just 2 blocks from the MacGyver residence draws their interest.
Thomas Overton's name had come up through some of the local detectives who worked that particular district because of his activities as a cat burglar, someone who will enter a house, perhaps even with the residents still there. He'd been found not only here in Monroe County, but in other areas of the state, apparently scoping other houses or stalking other houses.
Overton's past record and the fact that Missy MacGyver bought gas at that station prompts one local detective to write a memo outlining his suspicions. His conclusion? While I am not saying that I think Overton is responsible for the MacGyver homicides, I think that he definitely warrants looking into heavily. But just when detectives begin to take a closer look at Overton, something happens to change their focus. They get a tip that the murders may have been drug-related after all.
We received information from a gentleman with the FAA in Miami that he had spoken to a man who had claimed that two gentlemen from Colombia had admitted early on to this murder, and had given us some information in this that had not really been released and seemed to corroborate what had happened at the scene.
But Dale Hinman still isn't convinced this is a drug deal gone awry. In her mind, the evidence from the crime scene stubbornly suggests otherwise. A tip has convinced some detectives that a pair of Colombian drug runners may have been out to get Michael MacGyver. But the new lead still has to be checked out.
We sent a couple of detectives and an FDLE agent to Central America to investigate Mike's activities down there. So the investigation certainly took that lead.
In this video, investigators reenact the crime. But when they look at how the victims were subdued, something doesn't quite add up. Agent Hinman thinks professional hitmen would have brought restraints and weapons to the scene. Instead, the killer, or killers, had used items found lying around the MacGyver's home.
There was a couple of different rolls of masking tape, which were the same type that was used to bind the victim. This is a drawer that contained belts, and there's another drawer that contained ties. So all of the items that were used to bind the woman were all items that were found in the house.
The drug deal theory takes a hit, and then it falls apart. The informant who gave them the tip fingering Colombian drug dealers admits that he fabricated the entire story. But even Hinman knows that the tip had to be checked out, just to be sure.
Everything needed to be done to eliminate possible drug relationships between Mr. MacGyver and anybody who was associated with his business who may have thought that he had information or may have mistakenly thought that there could have been drugs or money there.
When the drug connection turns out to be a dead end, it's back to square one for the homicide investigation. The list of local suspects now gets a closer look. On top of that list, Thomas Overton, the gas station attendant with a history of nighttime burglaries.
Immediately, we didn't have any real evidence for Thomas Overton to be a suspect, but we were reasonably certain he was still active in burglaries, and were able to actually apprehend him as he was attempting to enter a home in the Upper Keys to burglarize it.
In order to connect Overton to the MacGyver case, investigators need to get a DNA sample to see if it matches the stain on Missy MacGyver's bedsheet. But Assistant State Attorney John Ellsworth knows getting the sample won't be easy.
His name had come up as a possibility throughout the years, but Mr. Overton was not a person to ever consent, so they had not been able to develop any probable cause until this point. When he was apprehended for the burglary, he was actually asked at that point if he would consent to giving a blood sample, and he refused.
Then, in a bizarre turn of events, the problem is solved by Overton himself.
In the process of him being in the jail, he cut himself in the neck area with a razor that had been given to him to shave with. At any rate, he bled. He discarded the bloody tissue. It became our property.
Detectives now have the DNA sample they need. The bloody tissue is sent to the lab for testing. A few weeks later, the results come back.
I was in my office in Marathon when Scott Daniels with the FDLE called and asked me if I was sitting down. And I sort of blew him off and said, "No, what do you want?" I should have been sitting down. He told me we had a match.
According to statistics, the chance that the DNA belongs to someone other than Thomas Overton is 1 in 6 billion.
It was important to prove that there was no legitimate way that Thomas Overton's DNA would be or should be found in that residence.
Now, it's up to the suspect to try to explain away how his DNA was found at the murder scene. Coming up on Body of Evidence, can investigators crack their prime suspect? An exhaustive search for the killer of Missy and Michael MacGyver has finally led to a single suspect, Thomas Overton. His DNA matches DNA left at the MacGyver crime scene. But Special Agent Hinman and investigators know they have a long way to go before Overton can be charged with murder. That's why his interrogation is crucial.
One of the important things to get out of his interview was to have him admit, or most likely deny, that he had ever been in the home before. And therefore, he would have very little explanation for how his DNA would be present, much less how his DNA in the form of semen would be present in the home.
As detectives prepare to interview Thomas Overton, they consult with criminal profilers about an interview strategy.
In essence, by studying Mr. Overton's background and his habits and previous interviews with him, they suggested we attempt to get Mr. Overton to be a part of our investigation, to help the police. So we approached him one day. I told him that he was one of the better burglars in Monroe County. He had escaped our attention for so long that he must be very, very good.
You know, we've been looking at you for a long time, but I have concluded that if anybody knows the people that are doing things in Key Largo, because of the business that, quote-unquote, you're in, I think you would know.
The detective's first goal is to gain Overton's trust.
During the interview, Mr. Overton was indicating he wanted to cooperate. He was hoping that he would, by cooperating and helping solve other burglaries in the area, he would get some benefit out of this. So they were showing him houses, pictures of homes in the area that they knew had been burglarized, and some that hadn't been in prior crimes, and seeing if he recognized the houses and who did the crime. And he was being very cooperative, and yes, I know who did that one and that one.
But when detectives show him a photograph of the MacGyver house, Thomas Overton seems to draw a blank.
But I don't know, there's an icon, I don't know which house it is.
You don't recognize this house as anything that you know that anybody's burglarizing?
No.
You haven't burglarized this house?
No, definitely not.
Overton is shown photographs of Missy and Michael MacGyver and denies knowing them.
But not Mike MacGyver.
No.
How about Missy MacGyver?
No.
But when detectives openly question Overton about their murder, the suspect suddenly grows wary.
But you didn't have anything to do with that murder?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Matter of fact, I'm ready to go. I'll see what you're trying to do.
You don't know anything about that?
I don't know nothing about nothing. I don't want to talk to you about anything.
Okay. And you were never at that house?
I have nothing else to say. I'm going to leave.
I wish you'd let me,
I'm sorry.
let me tell you.
I don't want to talk about anything.
But at the end of the day, when all is said and done, it really didn't matter what he said because we had DNA evidence that proved it was him.
Finally, detectives confront Thomas Overton with the DNA evidence.
And I want to tell you one thing. In a sense, you cut your own throat. When you cut yourself, and we got that blood and took it into the DNA lab and matched that blood up with that semen that was left at that crime scene, it matched positive to you.
You know you were there. You know we're right. You know what we have is good stuff. DNA is good stuff. DNA is better than a fingerprint.
Based on the evidence recovered from the crime scene, Thomas Overton is charged with the murder of Missy and Michael MacGyver.
Thomas Mitchell Overton, the defendant in this case, has been accused of 2 counts of murder in the first degree.
After an investigation that lasts nearly 5 years, the case finally goes to court.
There really are no adequate words to describe how fortunate I feel to have been her sister.
The trial lasts only 10 days, and the verdict comes quickly. The jury deliberates for less than 2 hours.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged in the indictment of the offense of first-degree murder.
But it still does not bring closure to Celeste MacGyver.
If you lose a piece of property, a car, house, and get it back, that's closure. There's no closure to a murder of your baby, of your child.
A few weeks later, Thomas Overton is sentenced to death. He will pay with his life for the murders of Missy and Michael MacIver.
One of the factors a jury can consider is whether a crime is particularly heinous, outrageous, and cruel. And in this particular case, she was aware and conscious when she was being strangled to death at the end of her ordeal.
Dale Hinman had been right all along. Thomas Overton had gone to the MacIver home that August night looking for Missy. Her husband Michael was just in the way, and therefore, he had to die as well.
This is a loving wife and a happy marriage. She certainly wasn't doing anything to encourage an attack from an offender such as Overton.
There's no way to anticipate crimes. There's no way to tell when a person who's committed to burglaries will change and become a rapist, or when a rapist will change and become a murderer. There isn't a way to just be able to tell that. I wish there was. I hope that we'll have an opportunity someday to sit down and talk to Thomas Overton and ask him why her, why that house, why that night. I'd like to ask him myself.